The Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. A quorum being present, the committee meets today to consider H.R. 4293 and H.R. 4294. Given time constraints, I would ask that members insert any written statements into the record. I will hold the record open until the end of the day in order to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. I now recognize myself for an opening statement for today's committee consideration of these two bills. Today, the committee will consider 4293 and 4294, two proposals that will help strengthen the retirement security of workers and families. Retirement security has always been a priority that stretches across party lines. We all want every American to retire with the dignity and financial security they deserve. It's why Congress passed the Employee Retirement and Income Security Act with near unanimous support. It's why John Boehner and Ted Kennedy worked together on the Pension Protection Act and why George Miller and I worked together on the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act. It's also why we are here today. We're here to improve protections for those who rely on the help of financial advisors when saving for retirement. This effort began 4.5 years ago when Congressman Phil Rowe held the first congressional hearing on the Department of Labor's proposed changes to the rules governing retirement advice. At the time, Chairman Rowe raised concerns that the Department's expansive proposal would hurt the very people it was intended to help, and those concerns were shared by Republicans and Democrats alike. Due to the leadership of Mr. Rowe and others, the Department would later withdraw its proposal. We had hoped that would mark the beginning of a more collaborative effort between Congress and the administration, one that would improve in a responsible way policies affecting retirement advisors. In fact, we have repeatedly expressed our willingness to do just that. Unfortunately, the Department has insisted on a different approach. After withdrawing its proposal in 2011, the Department went back behind closed doors to draft a new regulation that suffers from the same fatal flaws as the first. It creates a convoluted regulatory scheme that will drive up the cost of retirement advice. Men and women will lose access to their trusted financial advisors. Providing basic information about retirement planning will be severely restricted, and it will be much harder for small business owners to provide retirement plans to their workers. This regulatory proposal will hit low and middle income families the hardest. Wealthier Americans can already afford to hire professional advisors who direct and manage their investments on a near daily basis. Low and middle income families cannot. These families have fewer means to invest, and they often just need some help getting started and staying on the right track. The Department of Labor is threatening the ability of these families to find the help they need at a cost they can afford. These concerns have been expressed time and again by lawmakers in both parties serving on both sides of the Capitol. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to cross our fingers and hope the administration gets this right? Or are we going to put forward our own ideas to improve the law and protect families saving for retirement? The stakes are too high for Congress to sit back and do nothing. Fortunately, Republicans and Democrats are committed to a responsible bipartisan alternative. That is why Congressman Rowe, along with Congressman Buddy Carter, Richard Neal, John Larson, and Peter Roskam, developed the legislation we are now considering. Despite important differences, the bills before us today and the Department's regulatory proposal are similar in two important ways. First, they would both require financial advisors to serve their clients' best interests. There has never been any argument over whether a best interest standard is the right standard, but there are clear differences on how to implement it. This bipartisan legislation strikes the right balance between raising the bar on financial advisors and ensuring individuals have access to basic advice, like whether to roll money from one retirement account to another. Second, both the legislation and the Department's proposal recognize that transparency is vital to empowering individual investors. The legislation builds upon existing policies requiring advisors to disclose meaningful information to their clients, including how the advisor is compensated for his or her services. Unlike the proposed regulation, the bipartisan legislation provides investors with the information they need to make an informed decision and then lets them make the decision that's best for their families. Raising the bar on financial advisors and increasing transparency are how you strengthen protections for retirement savers. This bipartisan legislation accomplishes both in a way that doesn't harm the men and women who rely on the help of their trusted financial advisors. In closing, I'd like to briefly discuss the process because I suspect some of our colleagues will as well. More than 2 months ago, Mr. Rowe and others invited anyone wishing to craft a bipartisan alternative to the Department's proposal to join the effort. Not a single Democrat on this committee accepted the invitation. Yet here we are considering a bipartisan proposal in an open legislative process where Republicans and Democrats are free to offer their ideas. This is a stark contrast to the Department's own regulatory process. No one here has seen the latest draft of the Department's proposal. No one knows what, if any, changes the Department has made in response to public concerns, and no one will have an opportunity to review or comment on the final proposal before it is imposed on millions of families. The hardworking men and women trying to save for their retirement deserve better than an extreme partisan scheme jammed through a flawed regulatory process. This legislation provides members of Congress an opportunity to vote on a responsible, bipartisan alternative that will strengthen the retirement security of working Americans, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I will now recognize my distinguished colleague, Mr. Scott, the senior Democrat member of the committee, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this morning we're marking up H.R. 4293, the Affordable Retirement Advice Protection Act, as well as the provisions of H.R. 4294, the Strengthening Access to Valuable Education and Retirement Support Act of 2015, which are within the committee's jurisdiction. I understand that the Ways and Means Committee is scheduled to mark up the other provisions of H.R. 4294 tomorrow morning. These bills represent a deeply flawed response to the Department of Labor's efforts to update and modernize the definition of who is a fiduciary under ERISA as a result of giving investment advice. I'm a supporter of the Department's effort because I believe that existing regulations are insufficient to ensure workers and their families receive protections they deserve when investing their retirement savings. Americans' retirement savings are in need of protection, and that's what the Department's effort is all about. Regulations originally were issued in 1975 when a majority of retirement assets were held in defined benefit plans managed by professionals. Employer-based 401k plans did not exist, and IRAs had just been established. Today, as my colleagues know, the retirement planning and savings landscape has changed significantly, with more than $12 trillion in 401k plans and IRAs being managed by many individuals. Many of these individuals do not have sufficient experience or expertise in managing investment portfolios and must rely on professional financial advisors to plan and save for retirement. While most of these advisors do right by their clients, others do not. There are a lot of different financial products that Americans can purchase. Some have extremely high fees, while comparable products, often even better products, have lower fees. The current standard allows for unscrupulous advisors to give conflicted advice and push a financial product from which they will reap bigger profits, even if the product is not in the best interest of their client. As Secretary Perez has said, and I quote, "The corrosive power of fine print and buried fees can eat away like a chronic illness on a person's savings." Now, the Department is simply working to ensure that Americans, particularly those who have saved throughout their career and now are preparing for retirement, are guaranteed to receive the advice that's in their best interest. That's why I and many others have been supportive of the Department's efforts, and we trust that the Department will appropriately modify the original rule that was promulgated to account for legitimate comments they have received during the rulemaking process. But I believe that no matter what members may think about the Department's rulemaking effort, members should still vote no on these two bills. First, these bills permit unscrupulous financial advisors to continue to act in their own financial interests rather than put the best interests of their clients first. These bills would enable unscrupulous advisors to use fine print and boilerplate language that nobody understands to disclose and disclaim their way from their fiduciary obligation. The bill includes a narrow definition of when an advisor would have to disclose to a client that the advisor is offering advice under the fiduciary standard, but the bill provides a loophole for advisors to avoid the fiduciary obligation as long as a written disclaimer is provided that says, and I quote, "This information is not individualized to you, and there is no intent for you to materially rely on this information in making investment and management decisions." And that seems like the kind of fine print that's buried in credit card disclosures that nobody pays any attention to. The bill also enables financial advisors to avoid fiduciary responsibility by issuing a written disclaimer that information is being provided to a client in a, quote, marketing or sales capacity, whatever that means. Second, the bill establishes a constitutionally suspect process requiring Congress to affirmatively approve the DOL rule within 60 days after its enactment. This requirement is modeled after the partisan anti-regulatory legislation known as the REINS Act. The questions and concerns have been raised about the constitutionality of the REINS Act, and those questions and concerns apply equally to these bills. As Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee wrote last December in their minority views on the REINS Act, the REINS Act raises constitutional concerns because it may provide for what arguably is an unconstitutional one-house legislative veto. Now, that concern is validated by the Supreme Court case INS v. Shatta, where the court rejected as unconstitutional a House veto of a particular Immigration and Naturalization Service deportation suspension because it failed to satisfy the bicameralism and presentment clauses of the Constitution. The bill states that no such rule or administrative position promulgated by the Department of Labor may become effective unless a bill or joint resolution is enacted in 60 days. So let's say the Senate passed such a joint resolution, but the House defeated it. That effectively would reestablish a one-house veto that was struck down by the Supreme Court. This congressional power grab of DOL's rulemaking authority is likely to be in violation of the constitutionally mandated separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches, but the committee has rushed to mark up these bills, so there will be no legislative hearing to fully explore this or other questions. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to oppose the bills and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 4293 for amendment. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I will soon recognize Dr. Rowe to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize Dr. Rowe for 5 minutes to explain the substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here today to have this opportunity to consider these two proposals. As you mentioned, this is an effort we've been working on for a while now because it's a very important one, and it's important that we get it right. For hardworking men and women, retirement should be something to look forward to, as Chairman Klein is doing. Unfortunately, for many individuals, a comfortable, secure retirement seems unattainable. And that's why it's important that we as policymakers are doing what we can to help Americans build a secure retirement. Part of that effort is ensuring that they have the tools they need to plan for the future. For years, that's been our goal, and that's exactly why we're here today. When the Department of Labor first proposed changes to rules governing retirement advice, we had concerns. We completely agreed, and still do, that financial advisors should be required to act in their clients' best interests. Instead, our concerns were focused on the details of the department's proposal. It became clear that rather than help individuals obtain high-quality retirement advice, the proposal would make retirement planning harder for those who are most in need of assistance. So we, along with a number of our Democratic colleagues, called for the department to rethink its proposal. We held hearings, we wrote letters, and eventually the department decided to go back to the drawing board. Unfortunately, when they released their revised proposal last year, it was similarly flawed. Once again, it became clear the department's approach would make retirement advice unaffordable and inaccessible for low and middle-income families. Once again, we heard from small business owners who explained how they will be unable to offer their employees retirement plans if the department's rule goes into effect. And once again, we weren't alone in our concerns. Much like the department's first proposal, our Democratic colleagues in both the House and the Senate spoke out against the rule. In fact, nearly 100 House Democrats, including members of this committee, wrote to Secretary Perez about concerns they were hearing and concerns the proposal would limit the ability of certain individuals to access retirement advice. Those House Democrats also urged the department to seek a balanced approach that protects individuals while still protecting access to retirement investment advice for all Americans. That's exactly the approach we took in developing the two proposals we're considering today. With the administration clearly intent on pushing forward a flawed proposal, I, along with several colleagues from both sides of the aisle, began working to come up with a legislative solution. We developed a set of principles to guide that effort, and after much work and collaboration, we put forward these two bills. Some say we should wait until the department finalizes its proposal. In other words, we should wait until it's too late. Instead, we drafted a bill that gives the administration a chance to get it right. If they release a responsible rule, Congress will approve the plan and will go into effect. If not, our bipartisan alternative will do what the department couldn't. These proposals will strengthen retirement planning by requiring financial advisors to look out for their clients' best interests. They will enhance transparency and accountability with several clear, simple, and relevant disclosure requirements. And they will protect access to high-quality, affordable retirement advice for all workers, retirees, and small business owners. I'm confident our bipartisan solution will ensure more Americans are able to successfully plan for their futures, and as a result, we're able to look forward to their hard-earned retirement. These changes in the proposed substitute amendment make a number of technical and clarifying changes to the original bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the substitute as well as the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. It's now in order for members to seek recognition to address the substitute. I recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to postpone this markup indefinitely and like to speak to that motion.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm offering this motion because I believe it's reasonable for our committee to reserve judgment until the department finalizes its rule. As colleagues know, the Department of Labor has been working on this matter for quite some time. In October 2010, the department proposed a rule to update and modernize the definition of who is a fiduciary under ERISA as a result of giving investment advice. In September 2011, the department withdrew the rule based on what they had heard from the public and went back to the drawing board. Last April, the department re-proposed the rule, and since that time, the department has been conducting a thorough and transparent process in an effort to get it right. The department held 4 days of public hearings last August and provided the American public approximately 140 days in which to comment and suggest changes to the rule. The department has also convened over 100 meetings, not including those with members of Congress. Last Friday, we understand the department has sent its rule to the OMB for review, and final rule is expected in the near future, so it's prudent for us to wait and see a final rule. In contrast to the department's process, the bills being marked up today were actually introduced on the last day of session in December. There have been no legislative hearings on these bills, and with a total of 7 co-sponsors on each bill and no Senate counterparts, the bills obviously lack widespread support. So quite simply, there's no legitimate justification for rushing to act on these flawed bills at this time. So I would urge support for my motion, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the gentleman's motion to postpone? Mr. Hinojosa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Scott, I rise today to strongly oppose H.R. 4293 and H.R. 4294, the Affordable Retirement Advice Protection Act, and the Strengthening Access to Valuable Education and Retirement Support Act. I have worked many years with Mr. Rowe of Tennessee, and together we've been able to find compromise on other bills that impact senior citizens and hardworking Americans. However, on these 2 bills, I join Congressman Scott in his motion to postpone action. As Ranking Member Scott said, I am concerned that H.R. 4293 and H.R. 4294 would permit unscrupulous advisors to continue to act in their own financial interests rather than in the interest of their clients. This legislation would weaken the already inadequate protections and afforded by current outdated regulations. It's my understanding that the U.S. Department of Labor submitted its rule to the Office of Management and Budget just a few days ago, January the 29th, 2016. The Department of Labor worked with both sides of the aisle and with many stakeholders. The department also extended their comment period beyond the 75-day comment period and held 4 days of public hearings. It seems to me the Department of Labor has been thorough and transparent in their process. In contrast, Republicans have hastily marked up flawed bills without holding legislative hearings. Finally, with minimal House co-sponsors and no Senate counterparts, these bills lack widespread support. So the question is, why would Congress not reserve its judgment until the Department of Labor finalizes the rule? The prudent approach would be to fully evaluate the final rule when it comes out and then determine if legislative action is warranted. I believe that these bills are a step backward. It is no surprise that many groups, including the American Association of Retired People, Americans for Financial Reform, as well as NCLR, and other key stakeholders are strongly opposed to this legislation. Hardworking Americans trying to save for retirement deserve rules that protect them. I expect that the Department of Labor's proposed rule will offer a balanced approach, and there is every reason to believe there will be final rule changes to reflect the many constructive comments received. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to delay this vote until the final rule comes out, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking Mr. Polis, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Ranking Member Scott's motion is appropriate because this markup is simply premature. Now, I want to be clear that, as everybody knows, there are bipartisan concerns, including concerns that I voice, as well as many Democrats on this committee, with the draft of the rule that was first rolled out over 5 years ago. And my goal and the goal of Democrats has been to make sure we update our standards to protect consumers, but also ensure that we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt valid business models that add value to potential retirees, and most importantly, doesn't hurt low and middle income savers. And we've had reassurances from the Secretary in this forum and others, Secretary Perez, that he will listen to and has heard our concerns. And I'm hopeful, and I remain hopeful, that the new version of the rules will address our concerns. It's a critical issue for financial security of retirees, and I believe that that while we had concerns, including concerns about financial education, the usability of the model contract, the way that lifetime annuities were compared to other products, I'm confident that Secretary Perez will address those concerns in the final rule, which is why I believe that this bill is simply premature, and we should be having this discussion after we see the changes the Department of Labor has made to the rule. And Department of Labor should show us the changes. That's why I'm signing a letter, sending a letter to see the revised rule, and I'd like to submit that to the record, Mr. Chair.
Without objection.
And as you know, as members of this body, we often inspect documents relating to national security or trade or other documents where we're able to look at those before they're public, or in some cases items that will never be made public. And I think it would be completely appropriate for members of this committee to know what we're talking about before we vote on presumably invalidating it. And we have a responsibility to ensure that any rule will serve the interests of the American people. And transparency with Congress is vital to the success of the rule. And I personally, as well as many of my colleagues, look forward to seeing that updated rule. I'm not opposed to any rule being implemented. I simply believe it needs to be done right. It needs to reflect the input from stakeholders. We have something called the Congressional Review Act that offers the opportunity for Congress to repeal rules. And the portion of this bill that is a targeted version of what this body had previously passed called the REINS Act really flips our normal Congressional Review Act on the head. It doesn't even guarantee that there would ever be a vote on a rule taking effect. Effectively, it says that the rule will not take effect unless there's a vote of Congress to let it take effect. Now, look, we all agree that there's a need here. Frankly, I think that the principles that are in this legislation can be a starting point for discussion. But the timing just doesn't make sense. We need to wait until we've had an opportunity to see and evaluate the rule. And remember what we're here for. Most Americans are not saving enough for retirement. The outcome of these bills and the Department of Labor's work will have an impact on Americans' retirement security, hopefully for the better. And that's why our work is so important. I thank the gentleman for the time, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to address the gentleman's motion to postpone? Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I do want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for working with us on this. And certainly we look forward to going forward with this. Let me just speak to the rule for just a second. I live in a part of the country in northeast Tennessee and southwest Virginia where I've seen a rule making basically destroy a part of the United States. And we have lost thousands of jobs because of an EPA rule about emissions from a coal-fired power plant. We put thousands of my neighbors out of work, hundreds in a small rural community right next to me that used to work for a railroad that don't anymore because of a rule. So rules have consequences. And if this rule were a good rule, it should be out there for us to see right now. We're saying let's let the cow out of the barn and then go ahead and try to fix it after you've let the rule be proposed. I think we already know, we've had numerous hearings beginning in 2011 through the subcommittee on health, employment, labor, and pensions, which many of the members of this full committee are members of. And so we've had thoroughly vetted this. We've had open hearings many times, roundtables, to have people come in and speak. We've had Secretary Perez in. It seems to have fallen on deaf ears. You know, I found it interesting that the RAINS Act was mentioned. We didn't seem to have any problem when we voted for the Affordable Care Act, and essentially gave up Congress's ability to change anything in Medicare and gave all that power with the IPAB bill to one person, which is the Secretary of HHS. That didn't seem to be a problem. I think I have seen this in the past, how rules, once they're implemented, are very difficult. And let me just give you a personal example. When I started my medical practice, we wanted to save for our retirement. We felt it was important for our employees to have a secure retirement. That was 38 years ago. So what did we do? We brought in first, we were a small group, only 4 people in the group. We brought in an advisor. And this advisor talked to us about how we could set up a pension plan and how we could do that. This rule requires that you sign a contract ahead of time before you even talk. And I mean, who's going to sign a contract with someone before they even know what their options are? So what we did was, in our practice, was we set up this advisor came in and set up our pension plan, a small business. I think that will go away if you look at the fee structures and so forth, that the finances are just not going to be there to do that for small business. And we had people testify in front of our subcommittee on this very issue. We then got bigger. As we got larger, we then moved into a fiduciary status and were able to do that. So for small and low-income and middle-income investors, I really am concerned that this will limit what their ability will be, and small businesses, as we started out as a very small business and then fortunately grew our business. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the concerns they have. I don't think we should wait, and I'd like to move to table the gentleman's motion.
The motion table is in order and is not debatable. The question is, shall the committee table the motion to postpone offered by Mr. Scott? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. We are now returning to debate, if any, on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Are there members seeking recognition on the substitute? You're recognized.
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
Adams.
Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Financial advisors play a critical role in managing our retirement savings accounts, the various types of insurance plans, and other income security investments. I think we can all agree that it's absolutely critical that these advisors are acting in the best interest of their clients. So in order to guarantee that advisors are representing their clients in strict fairness and objectivity, the Department of Labor must implement a rule that not only holds financial advisors to high standards, but also allows financial advisors to provide a range of plan options to their clients without fear of breaking the law. I support the goal of the Department of Labor to enhance workers' protections by establishing a new best interest standard that would require advisors to give advice that is in their clients' best interest. However, I remain concerned about the potential negative effects a final rule similar to the proposed would have on my constituents' ability to get cost-effective advice and access to needed retirement security solutions. These concerns were also shared in a letter signed by 95 other Democrats that was sent to the Department of Labor on September 24th. Most importantly, as my constituents look to educate themselves about retirement security solutions that would help them manage their hard-earned retirement savings, I hope that the Department of Labor takes the necessary steps to clarify that the rule does not disadvantage lifetime income options. I look forward to reviewing the final rule. I urge this committee to work closely with the Department of Labor and the administration to get this rule right for the many people that it will impact, including senior citizens, communities of color, and current retirees. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition on the substitute? If not, it's now in order for members to offer an amendment if they have one, and Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Dr. Rowe reserves a point of order. Do we have the, Okay, while the amendment is being distributed, the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I'm offering today seeks to ensure the security of Americans' retirement savings. And I bring to this discussion my experience as a consumer protection advocate. I started my career working at Legal Aid, helping families who were on the brink of losing everything. And I worked as a consumer protection attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. Throughout my career, I've advocated for families who, despite their best efforts, have found their financial and retirement security at risk. Too many families and individuals across Oregon and across the United States are struggling to get ahead. We all know the sacrifice that's involved in each and every dollar they set aside to contribute to their future retirement. The retirement landscape has dramatically changed in the past 40 years. The majority of retirement funds used to be in defined benefit plans. Employer-based 401k plans did not exist. IRAs had just been created. We're in a different world now. Providing products that are in the best interest of the client should always be a top priority. That makes sense. In a hearing this committee held last summer, all of the industry panelists agreed that consumers should receive advice that is in their best interest. In fact, I asked them directly, does everyone agree that a best interest standard means a best interest fiduciary standard? They all agreed. One said yes, the others nodded in agreement. This amendment simply requires that before the legislation is enacted, the director of the Congressional Budget Office must certify that the provisions in this bill actually will put clients and hardworking American families' best interest first over the financial interests of the investment advisor. I'm concerned that the legislation before us today essentially ends the progress being made by the Department of Labor on crafting an updated conflict of interest rule that seeks to protect our constituents' hard-earned savings and strengthen the ability for those in the middle class to save for retirement. At our hearing on this issue last June, Secretary Perez discussed the department's work to draft a comprehensive rule, and importantly, a rule that has been developed by working with diverse stakeholders and based on feedback from senior advocacy groups, civil rights groups, and importantly, the industry that provides these services. At the very least, we should be waiting for the rule to be released before we have this conversation. But because we're here today, having this markup, I encourage all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to protect consumers and ensure that their best interests are put first and that their financial futures are not jeopardized. I urge the adoption of my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Without objection, the point of order is withdrawn. Are there other members seeking recognition? Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is based on one important principle that we all share, and that's that retirement advisors should serve in their clients' best interests. And that's why Republicans and Democrats, including Congressman Richard Neal and John Larson, worked together on this important legislation. We believe we need to set a high bar for retirement advisors, and this bipartisan legislation does just that, while also ensuring that low and middle income families have access to affordable advice they need to plan for retirement. And believe me, I've worked in that environment for years, and they do need this help, and many are not very sophisticated, and nor am I, but so I need the help also. Unfortunately, this amendment would effectively deny these low and middle income families the basic protections outlined in this bipartisan bill. And as was mentioned, every day, countless Americans make decisions affecting their retirement savings based on the advice that they receive. And we believe if the CBO had the expertise to do what this amendment requires, and I think there's a real question about that, then they would find financial advisors were acting in their clients' best interests, and that's what because that's what this bill requires. Unfortunately, it would be impossible for the CBO to analyze millions of transactions that take place as men and women invest in their retirement, and which means that they would be denied the protections this bipartisan bill is meant to provide. It's unfortunate that we've injected partisan politics in what has been up to this point a bipartisan process working on this bipartisan bill. I wonder if our colleagues would subject the Department of Labor's proposal to the same level of scrutiny, and I very much doubt that they would. Mr. Chairman, oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Mr. Hinojosa, you're recognized.
I strongly support the amendment offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon. I think that she's made some very good, strong points that have been experienced by those of us who are employers and have had employees that depended on the financial advisors, and they chose what was going to give them the highest commission. And so I think that this is an excellent amendment that should be accepted by Congressman Rowe and our Chairman Klein and the other members of the other side of the aisle, because there is no question that if what they have just said that is already included, then they should have no problem in having the director of the Congressional Budget Office certify what he just said. So I strongly recommend that both sides of the aisle vote yes to approve this amendment offered by Congresswoman Bonamici. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition on the gentlewoman's amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. And the independent chair, the noes have it, and the gentlewoman's amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Excellent work. There are no other amendments. So we are going to move. I like it when I can turn 2 or 3 pages at a time. That's very heartening. We are ready to move to we got to go back to the substitute. Yeah. So the question now occurs. I forgot. Question occurs on the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Now, I can move those 2 pages. We are one page too far. If there are no other members wishing to speak on the bill, I will now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 4293 to the House of Representatives with an amendment and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and that the bill as amended do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4293 is... Was there a request for a recorded vote? I'm sorry, I missed it. There is a request for a recorded vote. It is my intention to roll that vote until after we've considered the next bill and take those recorded votes at the end of the process. Okay. Now we're ready to move to consideration of the bill H.R. 4294 for amendment. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I will soon recognize Mr. Carter to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize Mr. Carter for 5 minutes to explain the substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Klein, for convening today's markup of these two important bills. I'd also like to thank you, Dr. Rowe, not only for your role in the bipartisan effort that led to these proposals, but for your leadership on this issue over the past 5 years. Your work to hold the administration accountable for not one, but two flawed fiduciary proposals and your commitment to strengthening retirement security for all Americans have been critical to this process. As policymakers, we should be doing everything we can to ensure hardworking men and women have the tools they need to build a financially secure retirement. That's a goal I have taken very seriously as a member of this committee, and it's a goal that was very important to me as a small business owner. Having owned and operated community pharmacies for nearly 30 years, I was very proud to provide retirement plans for my employees. When you're a small business owner, your employees are like family, and you want what's best for them. You want to help them build a comfortable future, and when they leave your business, you want them to enjoy the retirement they worked so hard to achieve. Fortunately, I was able to do that for my employees. I worked with an advisor that I knew and trusted to set up a retirement plan, and as a result, my employees benefited. For me, providing that benefit was an important part of owning a small business, and it's a priority for many other small business owners as well. While working with our Democratic colleagues to develop these legislative proposals, Dr. Rowe convened a hearing to explore the consequences of the Department of Labor's fiduciary proposal and discuss the best way to protect affordable retirement advice. At that hearing, we heard from Rachel Doba, a small business owner from Indianapolis who started a civil engineering firm that focuses on local public works projects. Mrs. Doba has a trusted financial advisor who has helped provide retirement security for her 15 employees, who she called her family, as well as for herself. She considers her advisor a part of her team, and her employees trust him to provide educational materials that will help the team make sound financial decisions. Mrs. Doba explained that these resources are important to her both as an employer and as an individual, saving for her own retirement, but she is concerned the department's proposal puts all of that in jeopardy, and she's not alone. She and many employers like her are fearful that complicated and discriminatory new requirements will drive up costs and make it significantly harder, if not impossible, to help their employees plan for retirement. They simply don't have the time, resources, or expertise to do without the help of an advisor, so many of them will be forced to stop providing retirement advice to their employees altogether. And that's a big problem. Small business owners provide hundreds of billions in retirement savings for millions of households. If even a fraction of those small business owners are unable to provide their employees with retirement plans as a result of the department's flawed proposal, the impact on workers will be significant. Having had the privilege of helping my own employees save for their retirement, I know what cutting off such an important resource would mean for them and their families. That's why joining Dr. Rowe's effort to introduce a bipartisan alternative to the department's proposal was so important to me. These proposals will ensure financial advisors act in their clients' best interest. They will keep trusted retirement advice affordable for all families planning for retirement. And they will ensure small business owners continue to receive the help they need to provide the retirement plans their employees deserve. The technical change in the proposed substitute amendment simply corrects a typographical error in the original legislative text. I urge my colleagues to support the substitute as well as the underlying bill, and I yield back the remaining balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, several members have talked about setting up retirement plans with the advisors that they trust. But that's exactly the problem we're dealing with. Everybody trusts the advisor, and that works out well when the advisor is working in the best interest of the workers, but doesn't work so well when the advisor is working in his own interests and not that of the workers. And he can do that under this bill if he just passes along some boilerplate language that's buried in a bunch of forms and get people to and disclose his way out of the conflicts. Mr. Chairman, this bill also has the provision in it with the REINS Act provision that allows for one-house vetoes, which is constitutionally suspect. And I'd like at this time to enter into the record a letter from Ronald Levin, professor of law at Washington University at St. Louis School of Law, which goes into detail about how the case law is very clear that these kinds of legislative vetoes are unconstitutional.
Without objection.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, we are...
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition.
Yes, we're ready to move to other amendments, and Mr. Bratt, you're recognized.
Thank you.
You have an amendment?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk, Mr.
Clerk will distribute the amendment. Dr. Rowe, point of order is reserved. Okay, while the amendment is being distributed, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to keep this brief. As we agreed, I'm prepared to offer a related amendment to savings. Savings for retirement is more important than ever and will be with the increasing burden we're placing on future generations in many respects. CBO's new budget and economic outlook paints a rather frightening picture of the federal government's budget and the mounting debt burden. The more the debt grows, the more it will undermine opportunity, prosperity, and innovation. We need to reform federal programs to bring this spending under control. We also need to make it easier for the American people to work, save, invest, and live their lives the way they want. That's why Senator Jeff Flake and I have introduced the Universal Savings Account Act in November, H.R. 4094 here and S. 2320 in the Senate. Universal savings accounts are basically flexible Roth individual retirement accounts that let any American adult save and invest up to $5,500 per year of post-tax income. Earnings and withdrawals would be tax-free. They could be used at any time. Universal savings accounts could supplement retirement savings, of course, but they could also be used to save for a car, for college, a down payment on a house, and much more. Universal savings accounts are simple and easy to use. Canada and Great Britain have had similar savings vehicles for years. Canada's were established in 2009, and only 6 years later, 48% of Canadians had one, including many middle-class families. Universal savings accounts would also help create opportunity by reducing double taxation and expanding our national savings. U.S. personal savings is only about 5% now, much lower than it has been in the 70s or 80s. A few years back, it was near zero. In Macroeconomics 101, students learn that savings at the macro level equals investment. And without investment above depreciation, there is no economic growth. With a growth rate of only 0.7% in the last quarter of 2015, it's clear that we need to boost both savings and investment to get growth back approaching normal historic rates. My and Senator Flake's proposal has been endorsed by Americans for Tax Reform, the National Taxpayers Union, and the Association of Mature American Citizens. My Virginia constituents really like the idea, regardless of their political views. I hope we can all work together on ideas like this that transcend partisan politics and help all of our constituents better face life's many challenges.
Will the gentleman yield? The gentleman yield?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to withdraw my amendment and yield back due to germaneness.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment. Are there other amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If there are no other members wishing to speak on the bill, I'll now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 4294 to the House of Representatives with an amendment and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and that the bill as amended do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes appear to have it. Roll call vote is requested. All right, let me tally up where we are here. Despite the very generous offer of help from the ranking member, we're going to take the recorded vote on 4294 first. That's the bill we just finished, and then we'll go back to the amendment in 4293. So I will ask the clerk to call the roll on reporting 4294.
Mr. Klein.
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Fox. Aye. Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Rowe. Aye. Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Salmon. Mr. Guthrie. Aye. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Rokita. Aye. Mr. Rokita votes aye. Mr. Barletta. Aye. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mr. Heck. Aye. Mr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Bratt. Aye. Mr. Bratt votes aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Russell. Mr. Corbello. Aye. Mr. Corbello votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Allen. Aye. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Hinojosa. No. Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mr. Grijalva. No. Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney. No. Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge. No. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Polis. No. Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Sablon. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Bocan. Mr. Bocan votes no. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Jeffries. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desaulnier. Mr. Desaulnier votes no.
May I ask the clerk to go back and call the names of those members who have not responded?
Mr. Wilson? Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Salmon? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Russell? Ms. Stefanik? Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Jeffries?
How is Mr. Salmon recorded?
Mr. Salmon is not recorded. Mr. Salmon votes aye.
How is Mr. Russell recorded?
Mr. Russell is not recorded. Mr. Russell votes aye.
How is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson is not recorded. Mr. Wilson votes aye.
The clerk will report the total.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4294 is ordered, reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I recognize Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make the necessary and technical changes to the bill, and pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file additional or minority views.
Without objection, so ordered. It is now in order to take the recorded vote on H.R. 4293. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Hunter? Aye. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Aye. Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Aye. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Salmon? Aye. Mr. Salmon votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Aye. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Rokita? Mr. Rokita votes aye. Mr. Barletta? Aye. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mr. Heck? Aye. Mr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Messer? Aye. Mr. Messer votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Bratt? Aye. Mr. Bratt votes aye. Mr. Carter? Aye. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Grothman? Aye. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Corbello? Aye. Mr. Corbello votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Aye. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Aye. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? No. Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Sablon? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desaunier? Mr. Desaunier votes no.
How is Mr. Bishop recorded?
Mr. Bishop has not been recorded. Mr. Bishop votes aye.
Are there members wishing to change their vote? I always like to offer that up for Mr. Polis. Hope springs eternal. The clerk will report the total.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4293 is ordered, reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I now recognize Dr. Rowe.
I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and technical changes to the bill, and pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file additional or minority views.
Without objection, so ordered. Now, as is the practice of the committee, for those members who were not present for the vote on 4294, I would ask that the clerk record those votes, and the agreement is, just to remind everybody, that we allow that for members on both sides as long as it does not change the outcome In this case, I doubt that it will change the outcome. So if you could record Ms. Stefanik and Mr. Bishop on 4294.
Were you going to ask how they're going to vote?
Exactly. Well, that's, the clerk is going to ask them how they're going to vote.
Ms. Stefanik?
Aye.
Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye.
The new total?
And on this vote, the ayes are 22 and the noes are 14.
So the ayes still have it, and 4294 is still ordered reported to the House of Representatives. There being no...
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the following letters be entered into the record. An opposition letter from the Coalition of Sensible Safeguards, an alliance of over 150 scientific, labor, research, good government, faith, community, health, environmental, public interest groups. Another letter from Save Our Retirement Coalition, signed by 30 organizations. An opposition letter from the Financial Planning Coalition. An opposition letter from the Consumer Federation of America, and an opposition letter from the American Association for Justice.
Without objection. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.